When people talk about the richest empires in history, they usually speak in numbers. Tons of gold, miles of territory, centuries of dominance. It all sounds distant, impressive, almost clean. But empires are not built out of numbers, they are built out of people. Tonight, instead of celebrating wealth, we're going to sit quietly with what that wealth required, because behind every overflowing treasury was a population pushed just far enough, taxed just enough, worked just hard enough, frightened just long enough to keep the system running. These were not poor empires that became cruel out of desperation. These were rich empires that became cruel because they could afford to. And so, as the world slows down around you, let's drift through history's wealthiest powers, not to admire them, but to understand what it was like to live inside them. The Roman Empire was one of the richest political systems the ancient world had ever seen. Its economy spanned 3 continents. Its currency circulated across oceans. Its capital city consumed resources on a scale never seen before. But Rome did not create wealth, it absorbed it. Conquest brought land, land brought taxes. Taxes funded legions. Legions conquered more land. It was a perfect loop as long as expansion continued. For those living in the provinces, Rome often felt less like a civilization and more like gravity. There was no escaping it. Taxes were collected whether harvests succeeded or failed. Young men were conscripted into wars fought far from home. Local rulers survived only if they cooperated fully. Slavery was everywhere, not hidden, not shameful, simply structural. Slaves worked farms, mines, workshops, households, and ships. Some lived relatively stable lives, many did not. Mining slaves, especially, were considered disposable. If one collapsed, another replaced them. Rome's wealth shimmered in marble and bronze, but its foundation was human exhaustion. The empire didn't fall because it lacked riches. It fell because maintaining that wealth required more pressure than the system could sustain. Centuries later, another empire would master wealth accumulation with remarkable efficiency, and market itself as benevolent while doing so. The British Empire. At its height, Britain controlled trade routes, resources and labor across much of the world. Cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, rubber from Southeast Asia, grain from countless colonies. This wealth transformed Britain. It built factories, railways, universities and global financial institutions. It created the illusion of prosperity as a national trait. But for those supplying the empire, prosperity was rarely shared. Colonial economies were reshaped to serve imperial needs. Food crops were replaced with cash crops. Local manufacturing was dismantled. Taxes were enforced with rigidity that ignored drought, famine, or disease. In India alone, tens of millions died in famines during British rule, often while food continued to be exported. The empire did not starve people out of cruelty, but out of indifference. Markets were allowed to function naturally, even when that meant mass death. Slavery, though officially abolished, was replaced with exploitative labor systems that differed more in name than function. Workers were transported, contracted, and controlled with little regard for their well-being. Britain became wealthy not because it was uniquely innovative, but because it had access to the labor and resources of entire continents, backed by military force. The Spanish Empire experienced one of the fastest accumulations of wealth in history. After the conquest of the Americas, gold and silver flooded into Europe at an unprecedented scale. Spain's rulers imagined endless prosperity. What they received instead was a system addicted to extraction. Indigenous populations were forced into labor under systems designed to maximize output, regardless of human cost. Mines like Potosi became engines of death. Workers inhaled toxic dust, suffered mercury poisoning, and collapsed underground in darkness. The silver financed wars, palaces, and imperial ambition. But it also destabilized economies, driving inflation and eroding long-term stability. Spain grew rich quickly and learned too late that extraction without sustainability destroys both the exploited and the exploiter. For those at the bottom, empire meant watching their world be dismantled piece by piece. Land seized, traditions erased, bodies worked until they failed. The Mongol Empire controlled enormous wealth not through administration, but through fear. Cities that surrendered were taxed, cities that resisted were destroyed. Trade flourished after conquest, but only because resistance had been eliminated. Entire populations vanished from the historical record. Skilled artisans were spared and relocated, not out of mercy, but efficiency. The empire's wealth was mobile, extracted, and redistributed among elites loyal to the system. Stability followed terror, but it was a stability rooted in memory. The memory of what happened last time someone said no. For common people, Mongol wealth meant survival through obedience. The Ottoman Empire lasted for centuries, accumulating wealth through strategic control of trade routes and centralized administration. Its capital displayed refinement, learning, and artistic achievement. But longevity required discipline. Heavy taxation pressed rural populations. Conscription removed young men from their families for decades. The Devshirme system took children from their homes, converting them into servants of the state. Some rose high. Most did not. The empire functioned because resistance was managed early and forcefully. Wealth flowed upward. Stability flowed downward, unevenly and conditionally. Even empires often remembered fondly followed similar patterns. The Abbasid Caliphate presided over scientific and cultural flourishing, but it was funded by land taxes, slave labor, and rigid hierarchies. The Aztec Empire extracted tribute so aggressively that rebellion became inevitable. The Qing dynasty amassed wealth through agriculture and trade while burdening peasants with cycles of debt and obligation. No empire grows rich by accident. Wealth requires structure. Structure requires enforcement. Enforcement requires pressure. And pressure is always felt most by those least able to resist. What makes rich empires especially unsettling is not their brutality, but their normalcy. People woke up, went to work, raised families, and adapted. They learned which rules to follow, which words not to say, which taxes to pay first. Life continued, even under immense strain. Empire did not always feel like oppression. Often it felt like inevitability. That is how wealth sustains itself. Today we look back at empires and marvel at their scale, their architecture, their influence. But for most people who lived under them, empire was not a golden age. It was a system they endured. A system that demanded productivity, loyalty, and silence in exchange for survival. The richest empires in history were not rich because they were fair. They were rich because they perfected extraction. And when extraction finally exceeded endurance, they collapsed, leaving behind ruins, records, and unanswered questions. As you drift toward rest tonight, remember that wealth on an imperial scale always carries a shadow, one made of countless lives spent maintaining someone else's abundance. History remembers the gold, but the cost was paid quietly. Good night.